So as a marriage and family therapist, I've worked with couples on their communication. Let me advise you all, never start a conversation with, hey, you need to listen. Best believe I've learned the hard way. My son is biracial and his mother is white, and when I would approach his mom to talk about issues of race and how we would prepare our son to be biracial in America, her and I relationship became filled with conflict. Our conversations often begin with, hey, you need to listen, and ended with, you'll never get it or you just wouldn't understand. Well, about this time, I began working on my master's degree in marriage and family therapy, and I would see couples who were struggling with similar experiences as her and I. These couples wanted to improve their ability to communicate. Well, underneath these couples' experiences, I saw the interactions of emotions. As a result, I was able to open up with my son's mom about my fears, my concerns, and even some of the shame around my blackness. And in return, she was able to open up with me. In that moment, I was able to be vulnerable with Mallory, and in return, she was able to be vulnerable with me. I was able to hold compassion for her story, and she was able to hold compassion for mine. Her and I was able to connect deeply. That's when I noticed that how we are taught to talk about race does not involve the emotionality of such a complex issue. And as we begin to be attuned to the emotionality of race, we can begin to build bridges across differences, because the same patterns of oppression that exist within society exist within each and every one of us and influences how we interact with our own emotions. There are emotions in which we privilege and others that we oppress. Now, doesn't that sound familiar? Well, in today's talk, I'm going to talk to you about this idea of emotionism, which is the act of privilege in our emotions. We're going to see how we can connect across differences, whether differences around gender, sexual orientation, our race, or even religion, by being attuned to our emotions, freeing them up, and delivering ourselves with something I like to call emotional justice. Within our society, there's a dominant narrative that gives privilege to rationality and oppresses the power of emotions. For example, the argument that it makes sense for a man and woman to marry because they can bear children, versus two people who love each other should have the right to marry regardless of their sexual orientation or their gender. Even more general, in some of your own lives, you may have recalled conversations that sound something like, well, that makes sense. Okay, I get it. Yes, I can understand. And on the other hand, well, that's irrational. Don't be so emotional. Or one of my favorites, you shouldn't wear your heart on your sleeves. Within this narrative, we are taught to place judgment on those who do not fit neatly into the storyline, even when that person is ourselves. There's moments in my own life where I found myself saying things like, why do I feel this way? Am I losing my mind? I must be going crazy. It wasn't until I became a therapist and I began to speak the language of emotions that I began to rewrite this story in my own life. I began to pay attention to the emotional interactions between people, most important within significant relationships, especially those relationships where race matters. I found that I would fall into the stereotype of the angry black man and stray away from those who brought out the feelings of fear and shame. And I would surround myself by those who brought out those quote-unquote good feelings. You know, the feelings of happiness, excitement, joy, a sense of belonging. You know, those feel-good feelings. As with the emotions of the clients that I worked with, I become curious of what these emotions wanted and the purpose that they had in my life. I began to allow myself to feel these emotions in a process that I call being comfortable with the discomfort. As I paid attention to the anger that I felt as a black man, I noticed that within inside of me was a small child that was afraid that black lives don't matter, afraid that the next time he stopped by a police officer, he may lose his life, afraid that he'll fall victim to all the other obstacles that so many other black children fall victim to. Inside of me, this child was begging and screaming for protection, even in situations where protection wasn't needed. This is when I noticed that my anger gave voice to all of those emotions that I've been avoiding. And as I began to make space for those emotions by being mindful of their concerns and being open to their wishes, I began to relate to people differently. I began to relate to people in ways that genuinely express my feelings as someone who was raised in an oppressive society. Furthermore, I began to see that similar to my anger, acts of racism, hate, and discrimination was these marginalized emotions' extreme attempt of protection in those who commit such acts. For example, I recently taught a class on cultural competency, and there was a student in attendance whose facial expressions led me to believe that she wasn't interested in the topic. This was a white student, and she barely participated. Her lack of participation was often accompanied by blank stares and an occasional eye roll. And I assumed, like so many people who I encountered in the South, race was not something she wanted to discuss. Well, one day after class, she approached me and told me how passionate she was about diversity. Well, as you all can guess, to my surprise, I asked, right, how come she didn't participate? She began to explain that she really wanted to, but when she went to speak up, she was overcome by a paralyzing sensation. She said that she was afraid that no matter what she said, no matter what she would do, someone would get offended. Well, I began to explain to her how her silence may be perceived by others, and I encouraged her to share her experience. Well, in class, as she talked about her experiences, her look of disinterest was overcome by a desire and a passion to bridge gaps across cultural differences. For the first time, her classmates saw her differently, and I can speak to my experience and say that I saw this student in a different light. Her lack of interest and her not participating in class was not because she didn't want to be engaged in the topic, but it was come from a place of fear. Well, in conclusion, the examples that I've provided for you guys today may not fit everyone's experience. Some of you may not even agree with what I'm sharing with you today. But ask yourselves, how might your resistance fit with this idea of emotionism? What emotions are you working hard to oppress as you hear my words? This new way of relating to my own emotions not only allowed me to have compassion for myself, but also the compassion for other people. Pema Chodron so eloquently wrote that compassion is not a relationship between the healer and the wounded. It's a relationship between equals. Only when we know our own darkness well can we be present with the darkness of others. Compassion becomes real when we recognize our shared humanity. So having the courage and the willingness to be comfortable with the discomfort and to attune to our hard-to-feel emotions are our first steps in bridging gaps across differences. I once heard that the color of racism is fear. And I add to that, fear of our own emotions. Thank you.